Good afternoon, everyone. Am I live? Can everybody hear me? I'm Julia Tulovsky.
You're live. You're fine.
I'm live. Okay, because okay. Thank you. So I'm Julia Tulovsky. I'm curator for Russian and Soviet nonconformist art at the Zimmerli Art Museum, and it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to this event today. This is an online opening of exhibition curated by Maria Garth called Communism Through the Lens, Everyday Life, captured by women photographers in the Dutch collection. Maria is a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Art History at Rutgers University and a Dutch fellow at the Zimmerli Art Museum. Her research explores the history and theory of Russian and Soviet photography in the 20th century, and the exhibition that she curated is closely connected to her dissertation about women photographers, avant-garde art, and socialist realism. This is a special event for us because it's the first opening of an online exhibition, and Maria will give an introduction of her show, but before giving the floor to Maria for her overview, I would like to thank her and those who worked on the exhibition during these challenging times. And the online version of this exhibition will be available very soon on our newly designed website. And I thank Nicole Simpson, who helped putting it together for the online presentation. And the exhibition will be on view as soon as the museum opens to the public again, which we hope will be in September. And I welcome you to come and explore it physically. And I thank our registrars, preparators, colleagues from Communication and Education Office for making this exhibition happen. I will now give floor to Maria for her overview of the show, which will follow by a roundtable discussion with very special guests, Mark Sveda, Alice Tiffentail, and it will be moderated by Jane Sharp. And Maria will do the honor of introduction. So please, Maria, it's your show, your turn, and I will give you the floor for the introduction of your show.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to everyone who's here. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a moment. So I'm happy to welcome you today to this presentation of Communism Through the Lens, Everyday Life Captured by Women Photographers in the Dodge Collection. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we honor that Rutgers University is located on the ancestral lands of the still living, still sovereign Munsee Lenape people. We also honor the many and diverse Native American and Indigenous people who still call this region home, past, present, and future. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the exhibition and show you some works that are included in the exhibition. And after that, as Julia mentioned, I will turn it over to our speakers, Dr. Alice Tiffentail and Dr. Mark Sveda, who will talk more about different aspects of the collection in connection with this exhibition. So I'd like to start by just talking about some of the main themes of this exhibition. So the exhibition includes 15 artists along with 14 photography books and journals and 139 objects in total, all from the Zimmerli's Norton and Nancy Dodge collection of nonconformist art from the Soviet Union. And this is a collection of over 20,000 works of art by more than 1,000 nonconformist artists. And the way that the exhibition is divided is 5 main sections. I will be showing you works not in chronological order, but organized by theme. And the main themes of the exhibition are workers and labor, experimenting with the medium, Gender in the Body, Identity in the Self, and Portraiture and Fantasy. And this exhibition spans from the 1920s, right after the beginning of the Soviet Union, right after the Russian Revolution, and into the 1990s after the end of the Soviet Union. And this exhibition poses the question, what did it mean to be a woman photographer in the Soviet Union? So what did it mean to be a woman working as a photographer, either professionally or as someone trying to make work as a photographer, but not in a professional capacity? And for the artists in this exhibition, this was a critical question because as the Soviet Union was forming in the 1920s, art and all of everyday life and society and culture were being reimagined, and more than ever before, artists had an opportunity to shape the future of their medium and to shape the history of photography. And I think one of the most exciting things about the artists I'm going to show you today is the way that they had a very direct hand in shaping Soviet photography. I'll begin by showing you the first section, Workers and Labor. The photographers in this section are Natalia Sakomska, Lilia Kuznetsova, Olga Ignatovic, and Olga Lander. And this section deals with representations of labor in the Soviet Union. So labor of all kinds, not any sort of traditional labor that you might imagine, like factory workers, but labor of all sorts. And Olga Nakovic is a really exciting photographer that I'm really excited to include here because she was one of the first Soviet photojournalists. She began working in the 1920s, and she was one of the very first women working in Soviet photography as a professional photographer. She worked closely with her brother, Boris Ignatovic, and his wife, Elizaveta Ignatovic, and together they were part of the Ignatovic Brigade, and they had a very similar style. They were all influenced by the Soviet avant-garde of the 1920s and being part of the October Group, which was a radical group of artists in the 1920s and early 1930s that was dedicated to advancing avant-garde ideals in photography. And in images like this, Olga Ignatovic captured everyday life. She photographed all sorts of situations and all sorts of assignments. She worked for Soviet periodicals, and she also served as a photographer during World War II when she photographed on the front lines. So she had a really exciting career, and I think she is a great way to sort of kick off this look at Soviet photography in the 1920s and 30s to give you a sense of, I guess, where Soviet photography began right at the beginning, and before socialist realism. So I'll talk about socialist realism in a minute, but this is the beginning with the avant-garde influence on Soviet photography. And Olga Lander is the next photographer, someone who is a contemporary of Olga Ignatovic. Olga Lander was working in the 1940s, and the workers that she was photographing were the Red Army. She served on the Soviet front in Europe. She was a photojournalist and photo correspondent on the front lines during World War II, and she traveled with the army and photographed scenes like this. And she's really well known for capturing images of kind of everyday moments and just routine things like this, moments that may have otherwise been forgotten, not grandiose scenes of battle, but rather sort of still images like this. And Natalia Sakomska was someone who was working in sort of a similar style, you might notice, but much later. She was working in the 1980s, and I thought that she was an interesting artist to pair with Olga Ignatovic and Olga Lander, because she was photographing sort of similarly. She was interested in photographing workers in Leningrad in the 1980s, which is present-day St. Petersburg. And this is one of her better known series of work, Nevsky Trudovoi Honor Board. She was photographing workers who were working on a main avenue in St. Petersburg. And then another one of her series is this one where she, at the same time in the 1980s, was photographing artists that she knew in Leningrad. In other exhibitions that we've had of the Dodge collection, we've shown a lot of art from St. Petersburg, Leningrad. And I thought this was a nice image to include as to show you sort of another view of the artists at that time. And then moving on to the next section, experimenting with the medium, Ina Stur, Veronica Lapari, and Maria Nigriska. All of these photographers were working at the end of the Soviet period. They were contemporaries of Natalia Sakomska. And their work is different, though, because they're really focusing on experimenting with the medium and seeing what they can do with photography, pushing it beyond the literal, pushing it beyond social documentary photography, and reacting against socialist realism. So at the time when Olga Ignatovic was photographing in 1934, socialist realism was instituted as the official style in the Soviet Union. And this influenced photography thereafter. Of course, photographers themselves had a hand in shaping what socialist realism looked like for photography. But nevertheless, there was a kind of definite shift in style. And so photographers like this from the nonconformist period were reacting against official dictates and trying to make photography that was a very clear reaction against any kind of official or professional Soviet photography. So Ina Stur on the left, combining different images, manipulating the negative, layering images, adding color tinting by hand to create the color effect. And then Veronica Lapari in the center, working with 1930s glass plate negatives and manipulating them to create this kind of uncanny look at the past. She's working in the 1990s after the Soviet Union, as the nation is kind of at the same time looking into the past, but also into the future. And Maria Nigriska, who was a photographer and a painter, and someone who used photography to kind of question what the boundaries are between photography and painting, and why we consider one to be sort of distinct from the other. She's really looking at those boundaries and trying to create photography that might actually look like painting. Just a quick close-up of the Veronica Lapari image, Broken Archive, and a really interesting amount of detail here. So hopefully you'll have a chance to look at this more. And then gender and the body. Zenta Vidinskis is a really exciting Latvian photographer. She was working in the 1960s in Riga. I will not talk about this one in a lot of detail because actually Alice Tiffentail, our guest speaker today, is Zenta Vidinskis' daughter and an art historian, and she'll be speaking more about her. But I wanted to sort of introduce this artist just to say that I wanted to include a lot of her work in the exhibition as a way to show how nonconformist or unofficial photographers were working within the camera club movement in the 1960s and creating work that was questioning official dictates and also trying to make work that was very distinctly their own. So Zenta Vidinskis' work is not in any way like expressly Soviet, I would say. And perhaps Alice disagrees, but I think what's interesting about her work is that she has a very unique characteristic style that is all her own. And she was photographing her own life and people that she knew in Riga and creating images that are, I would say, reacting against official culture, something that is very much her own. And I hope that Alice will tell us more. And another images like this that are also very tongue-in-cheek and sort of humorous. Here where she has a stone woman representation with a tank in the back. Identity and the self is the next section with Lunila Federenco. This photographer is working in the 1990s and taking images and manipulating them. So she is taking found photographs and altering them in different ways. Also to sort of comment on the past, literally the time before I was born. But again, doing this at the time in the 1990s as the Soviet Union has ended and photographers are thinking about what it means to create photography after the Soviet Union and to break from past confines. And then lastly, portraiture and fantasy. This section includes portraiture work, but not maybe the kind of like studio portraiture, but more informal, candid portraiture and fantasy kinds of images. This section has Mara Breshmone, Valentina Kulagana, Violeta Bubilai, wife Tayeva, Tatiana Lieberman, Ann Tenno, and then Soviet photography journals and books from the Zimmerli's collection. This is an image by Maria Breshmone. She was a photographer who was a contemporary of Zenta Vidinskis, also working in Riga, Latvia, and also part of the camera club movement, creating images of everyday life and street photography. She had a very prolific career, photographing people that she knew and street life in Riga. And images like this, which is a self-portrait. And then next, Valentina Kulagana. She was working in the 1930s, right after the beginning of socialist realism. This image and other photo montages from this series were created for an agricultural exhibition in Moscow in 1939. The exhibition was intended to showcase the bounty of the Soviet agriculture and just the kinds of sort of plentitude of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1930s. And artists like Kulagina were commissioned to create images for the pavilions of the agricultural exhibition. It was sort of like a World's Fair in Moscow. And so if you look closely here, both of these images are a photo montage. They're created by cutting up photographs and then pasting them together into a photo montage composition. And Kulagina is really well known for her photo montage. She was an avant-garde artist who successfully transitioned her career into the 1930s and beyond, and was able to use her avant-garde training as a successful state photographer in the Soviet Union. And then Antenno created self-portraiture, very fantasy-like meditative images in the 1980s where she is photographing her own body. And we have more images from this series in the virtual exhibition that I'm going to talk more about in just a second. And Violeta Bubilite, who is a Lithuanian photographer and someone who began by photographing her own body in the 1980s. And at first, she was heavily criticized for this kind of work, but she continued working in this way and photographing her body and later gained more success. But someone whose work is a really interesting example of women doing self-portraiture in the Soviet Union and against trying to push at official confines where nude photography was officially banned. And then lastly, the exhibition includes Soviet photography books and journals as a way to show how these images would have circulated. So some of the books and journals were for professional photographers and some were for the everyday person. So this spread here from Women's Journal from 1929 has images by Elizaveta Mikulina, who's one of the first Soviet women photojournalists. She was a contemporary of Olga Ignatovic and also began working in the 1920s. And then USSR in Construction, which was maybe the nicest, the glossiest Soviet publication from the 1930s, which included photography and design by the leading designers, the most famous Soviet artists and photographers. And this issue was designed by El Lisitsky and Sophie Lisitsky-Coopers. So a really great example of professional Soviet photography at its finest. And then this is a selection of different kinds of journals and books. We have several photography manuals. I wanted to show how people who wanted to learn photography and approach photography from an amateur standpoint could learn photography. So Photo Group Assistance on the right is a kind of manual or instruction book for someone learning photography. Pioneer was a journal for children, which had material about how to be a communist citizen, how to be a communist sort of from childhood or from a teenage age. But very interestingly, it featured a lot of photographs by Soviet avant-garde photographers and women photographers. And then lastly, Novy Lev and Lev in the center, the left front of the arts. This was a really important journal for advancing photographic theory in the Soviet Union. And then I'm going to wrap up here, but lastly, I wanted to show you some images from the forthcoming virtual exhibition. One of the things that we wanted to do was to make all of the images from the exhibition all 139 or close to it available for you to view. So this will be available soon on the Zimmerli's website, and you'll be able to look through all of these sections and page through the images and look through the different sections that I've been talking about. And just to show you here, these are the photographers that are included in the virtual exhibition that will be launching soon. And you'll be able to look through these images yourself. And these are the photographers that I've been talking about. So I will stop there. Next, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Sveda. Mark Sveda is a senior lecturer at The Ohio State University in the Department of the History of Art and the OSU Film Studies program, where he teaches cinema history and contemporary world cinema courses, specializing in Latvian modern, Soviet era, and contemporary art and visual culture. His publications have addressed a range of topics, including hippie fashion, experimental film, dandyism, architectural subterfuge, and photo-derived art. For 15 years, he served as the Latvian acquisitions agent for the Dodge collection and authored the Latvian component of the Rutgers University Press monograph, Art of the Baltics, The Struggle for Freedom of Expression Under the Soviets, 1945 through 1991, as well as the essay On the Verge of Snapping, Latvian Nonconformist Artists and Photography, and the Rutgers University Press anthology, Beyond Memory, Soviet Nonconformist Photography and Photo-Related Works of Art. So I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Mark Sveda to tell us more about the Dodge collection and his experiences working with Latvian photographers in the collection. So Mark, I will turn it over to you. Oh, you're muted.
Muted. Thank you, Maria. It is an honor to be here, and it is both a professional honor and a personal honor because I have had a long association with the Dodge collection, predating its donation to Rutgers University, and that continued with the bequest. And also, I have personal relationships with some of the artists in this show, as well as some of the other people on this program. So when I was first asked to participate, I was very excited because having heard of the general shape of this show, I thought this would be my opportunity to speak publicly about the art of two photographers that I respect deeply, Zenta Vidinskis and Maria Breshmone. And then I was even more delighted to hear that, in fact, Zenta's daughter, who was a dear personal friend of mine, Alice, would be speaking. And I thought, well, I wonder what she's going to want to talk about. And at that point, I had to regroup and rethink what I was going to discuss. And rather than simply shift my focus over to the other Latvian friend and admired artist, Maria, I was asked to give a little more context for the Dodge collection, for how its photography component came about, my participation in this, and so forth. So what I've come up with for you today is a small presentation called Photography, Women, and the Other Woman of the Dodge Collection. And the other woman of the Dodge Collection would be me. So I have the deep personal privilege of living with some of the works in this exhibition. I walked past these two works by Breshmone and Vidinskis many times during the course of a day in my bedroom hallway. Stone Woman, which you saw, or well, you've seen both of these works earlier in Maria.
Mark,
yes.
Sorry, Mark, I need to interrupt. Are you meaning to share your screen right now?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, so you need to press that green button. I thought it sounded like the green button share screen at the bottom.
Yep. Here, let me get back to the Zoom.
Okay, that looks good. And then you can play your, yeah.
There we go.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. So these are the works that I walk past every morning or every day, all day long. Stone Woman, which was a subtle commentary on the Soviet military presence in other republics by Zenta, and Mata's work Cabbages, which I've written about in a number of contexts because it was initially refused exhibition, public exhibition. If you look closely at the photograph here, despite the glare, you'll see a hat has fallen down in the shop window behind these cabbages. And so you have this wonderful kind of street photography aesthetic, but the small-minded apparatchik thought the fact that there was a hat associated with the cabbages was some sort of rebus that was making a commentary on Soviet mentality, or more particularly, the Soviet censors' mindset. So these are works that I won't talk about at length, but these are works that I acquired for the Dodge collection by Zenta Vidinskis. And the works that I acquired by both of these women, I've discussed in a variety of publications, the ones we've already listed, as well as a catalog of Zenta's work. And Mata's work, while I've had less opportunity to talk about it specifically, I've been able to include it as documentation of other phenomena and other artists that are in the Dodge collection, such as Anders and Intra Greenberger, whose birthday it is today. So it's important, though, I think, to recognize from the get-go that women artists were supported very profoundly by Norton Dodge, and the collection itself bears the name of a woman. It's Norton and Nancy Dodge's collection, and Nancy herself, after Norton's passing, has become solely identified with the source of the collection at the Zimmerli. The story of Norton's collecting is really quite widely known, first through a profile piece in the New Yorker by the journalist John McPhee, who Norton just happened to be riding on an express train between Washington and Philadelphia many years ago. It then was reshaped into one of John McPhee's books, which kind of over-dramatizes Norton's collecting as kind of there's this whole narrative thread. Is Norton really a CIA agent? Was Norton doing all of this as some sort of Cold War ploy and all of that, which is a little disingenuous. And as Nancy Dodge would say in the book itself, Norton would have trouble finding his way out of a paper bag. So the idea that he was this double agent going in the Soviet Union and collecting art to start to erode the foundations of the Soviet system is a little grandiose. But Norton's interest in women and the place of women in the Soviet cultural experiment was something foundational for his own economic work. This is a screen cap from his New York Times obituary, which says that his Harvard doctoral dissertation was Trends in Labor Productivity in the Soviet Tractor Industry, which ostensibly was true. Norton had initially applied to study in the Soviet Union in the 1950s to study the role of women in the Soviet labor workforce. And for some reason, Soviet officials were not comfortable with that proposal, and he was turned away for a year. And so then he went to something that was much more ideologically palatable to the authorities. What he did, being as crafty as he is Norton was able to do the research for his original dissertation idea at the same time that he did the Soviet tractor industry. And his research eventually came to light a few years later in his very first book, Women in the Soviet Economy. Norton's interest in Latvian women's artists was also well established by the time I met him. I met Norton when I was asked to curate an exhibition for OSU's University Gallery as a master's student, much in the same kind of capacity as Maria. And I borrowed heavily from Norton's collection. And Norton's collection, while very extensive in most nationalities, in its Latvian and Lithuanian components, it was a little less representative of the true breadth of the nonconformist and unofficial art activities. And as I wrote for other exhibitions taken from the Dodge collection when it was still in private hands, he began to see a lot of names that he didn't have in his collection. And so that's when he asked me to start collecting for him. So if you're not familiar with the life of Norton Dodge, it really is this amazing study in contrast. Here was this man of ample means, and he lived in a pretty rarefied former tobacco plantation estate on the Patuxent River. And if you were to go there, as I did as a graduate student to pick works for this first exhibition, you see this really unassuming sign by the road. Then you go down a long manicured gravel driveway through woods, and then you emerge into fields and paddocks. You go past these totally exemplary tobacco barns in the Maryland country vernacular. And at that time, they really contained less farm equipment and tobacco than they did Soviet nonconformist art. And eventually you would get to the homestead itself, right at the side of the river. And you would go through these gates. This is where Norton's personal archive was housed for many years, a lot of charming agricultural, bucolic type structures. And then the manor house itself, which basically grew over the years from this kitchen wing on this old kitchen wing on the right. The new modern kitchen was on the left, and this pretty great central hall plan, which now appears on architectural tours for the Maryland Historical Society, was where Norton basically accumulated enormous amounts of paper and art and so on. So much so that I think in a move of self-preservation, Nancy Dodge ended up living in a townhouse in Georgetown for the first couple decades that I knew the Dodges. She had her own career as a concert organist. She was closer to her work as the head of the American Organist Society, and her concert engagements, but she also was at a comfortable distance from Norton's chaos. And they were still so incredibly connected. He talked to Nancy every night at the appointed hour. And as much as he wanted to talk about an impending trip to Latvia and is what he wanted from those acquisition trips, that particular 2-hour period when he spoke to Nancy was absolutely off limits. Now, collecting for Norton was its own challenge, particularly in the early days. It was hard to get to Riga. You could have one flight in and one flight out every day, not necessarily with the good old Soviet airline, but with Western airlines that were starting to get a toehold in the former Soviet space. But the bigger problem was to go over there with enough cash to acquire art. And so and I had to do it, safely and enough on the sly. So I always wore fanny packs, and unfortunately, they didn't have these nice printed fanny packs with beer bellies on them at the time. But I can say that I would have tens of thousands of dollars strapped around my middle, and I looked like a paunchy businessman. And then I would show up and get in my seat, and they made excellent lumbar support. And then I'd go give the proceeds to the artists in Latvia as I was making these acquisitions. Coming in the other direction was just as difficult. I had to get photo documentation of all the acquired works. And this is where I met Mara Breshmone. In fact, she was the staff photographer for the Latvian State Art Museum. And it was recommended to me that I would just take as many works as I could to the photographic studio in the museum. She had the setup, and she would make perfect images that they were already used to seeing in terms of archival type documentation. Then there'd be an art expert who would make sure that I was not pillaging the cultural patrimony or matrimony of Latvia. Then I'd have to get all the paperwork in order, which was only a little more onerous in the Soviet period. There were as many stamps and levels of permission in the immediate post-Soviet years. My artist friends consented to giving up their own kind of rarefied practices, contemporary art practices, to build these massive crates for me to load up and pack and get to the airport. And of course, the taxis in the early days were these little ladas, so you had to make special arrangements for trucks and vans. And once you got to the airport, things like assemblages and so on were deeply suspect for customs. They thought I was smuggling out something. And once I'd get to the United States, things like Andras Brej's bread boxes would alert the USDA sniffer dogs, who thought that it smelled like a delicious food item. And there were, of course, bribes to the cargo handlers in Riga, because they often had to try and force these crates onto these little tiny regional aircraft that couldn't quite handle the capacity. So that was just the logistics of this. But then there was this problem. Nancy was a safety valve for Norton's kind of compulsive collecting. And it was easy enough to get away with these buying trips when Nancy was in Georgetown in the townhouse. But eventually, she wanted to live close, her career was winding up. She wanted to live closer to Norton, and she moved to Cremona. And that's when the real subterfuge had to begin. And that's when I kind of became the other woman, because it required the kind of minute planning and sneakiness, downright deceit of somebody engaged in an extramarital affair. So this is an aerial view of Cremona, and you would approach down this windy road through the forested area to the left. And then that big straightaway was where the real danger occurred, because Nancy gave up professional organ concerts for horseback riding, and there was no telling where she would be on the property on horseback when I would arrive with the loot from Latvia. So she had a certain kind of routine there as well, though. So Norton would say, you have to arrive between this time and this time. Don't come to the main door, swing wide around this particular horse barn, and that sort of thing. And I would get to the manor house, and then I would sneak over to the new kitchen door and knock and make the delivery. And just as a kind of side note about the rich character that Norton was, I've seen him wear flannel shirts with the sleeve attached with duct tape. And that poor Dodge Caravan, he'd driven into more than a couple low-hanging tree branches on the front lawn. Rather than just taking the driveway, he would take the shortcut. So this was Norton Dodge. So I would arrive with the art and it normally went well. And the last time that I came with a shipment of art from Latvia, Nancy was supposed to be horseback riding, but I heard the piano being played in the main part of the house here. And it stopped as soon as I knocked on the door. And she goes, "Is that Mark's voice I hear?" And she came to join us. And I, of course, had a big folio of work under my arm. I told a bald-faced lie and said that I was just returning things that had been borrowed for an exhibition. She gave me this knowing smile and says, "Well, that you boys do what you have to do." And Mark, I'm going to show you our newly restored house across the way after you're done. And so Norton took the new acquisitions to the archival building, and we talked for a couple hours, and then Nancy basically took me by the earlobe and gave me a perfectly charming tour of the new house, but it concluded with me standing over the ledger books of Cremona Farm, and she was pointing out that this breakwater repair was $500,000, and we had to acquire that promontory south of the manor house, because that's where the first polo game was played by British soldiers who had invaded the continent, and so on. And she looked at me in the eyes and she says, "Norton cannot spend another penny on art. Do you understand?" So there it was. We were caught. And of course, as we exited this house, we were greeted by Norton, who gave me a couple of bottles of his estate bottled wine and pressed a couple $1,000s into my hand and said, "I need to get some photography. I need more Latvian photography." So that's the last time that I did anything like that for Norton. So while I was accustomed to buying paintings, which was really Norton's preference when I first met him. He valued graphic art and painting well above photography. It took some persuasion that, in fact, photography had its own value, and there was photographic documentation of performance that I started to acquire for him. By the end, he was totally on board with buying this photographic work, not just these paintings and installations. And by the end, he was patronizing galleries in New York that in fact sold the work of Latvian artists in the fully American capitalist system, such as the Mimi First Gallery in Soho. And this is one instance when I'm actually looking more disheveled than Norton, which is really kind of an accomplishment with the owner and gallerist, Virginia Kinsey. So that is my story of getting away with murder with the Dodge collection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Such a great story. Thank you so much for that context. So I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Alice Tiffentail. Dr. Tiffentail is an art and photography historian based in New York City and Riga, Latvia. She holds a Ph.D. in art history from the City University of New York. Her fields of expertise include sociology of culture, cultural analytics, photography and social media, global history of photography, transnational history of cultural networks such as photo clubs, and the art and photography of Latvia. Tiffentail is the author of The Photograph as Art in Latvia, 1960 through 1969, and the author or editor of several other books about photography. Her articles are published in journals such as Art Margins, CAA Reviews, Networking Knowledge, Photo Researcher, Russian Art and Culture Journal, and Scriptus Manet, and she has contributed chapters to volumes including the Routledge Companion to Photography and Visual Culture, exploring the selfie, historical, theoretical, and analytical approaches to digital self-photography, the history of European photography in 1970 through 2000, and post-digital aesthetics, art, computation, and design. She co-curated, together with Anne Barlow and Courtney Finn, North by Northeast, the pavilion of Latvia at the 55th International Art Exhibition, La Biennale di Venezia from 2013. So welcome.
Thank you, Maria, for inviting to participate in this event, which is a great honor. And I also have to say thank you to Mark because Zenta Vidinskis photographs are in the Dutch collection entirely thanks to you. I would like to show you some images. Let me share some slides. It is truly exciting for me to see photographs by my mother, Latvian artist and photographer Zenta Vidinskis, in this exhibition alongside the works by Russian avant-garde artists and photographers such as Valentina Kulagana or Olga Ignatovic, or as well as notable photographers working in the 1980s. Because Zenta's work occupies a somewhat different and less clearly defined universe, as it was not considered art at the time of its making, and she herself never identified as a photographer, but rather as an artist. And to approach the variety of her images from the 1960s that are on view in this exhibition, wonderfully curated by Maria, I propose to, let's say, triangulate between these three functions of photography, namely art, photo club culture, and private diary, because these three functions often overlap in her images. Photography for her was oftentimes a medium for private visual diary, for private documentation, as well as artistic experimentation. Yet some of her photographs were successfully circulated in the international photo club culture of the 1960s, and 40, 50 years later, some of her photographs are considered art. And the most prolific time for Zenta Vidinskis in terms of photography was between early 1960s and mid 1970s. After that, she chose a career as a graphic designer and put all photography related things away. Literally, she stuffed it in some boxes at the back of the attic. And when I was a child growing up in the 80s, she hardly ever made any family photos. And I can say that I had no idea that she used to be a photographer. And only by accident, I saw some of her photo exhibition catalogs from the 1960s. And then gradually I learned about that part of her life. And Zenta only began to revisit her photographic archive in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that happened largely thanks to Mark's visit to Riga and his interest in her work. And besides Mark, no one had seen her images for 20 or 30 years. And you might be surprised to learn that until recently, the Dutch collection at the Zimmerli Art Museum was the only museum collection in the world that had ever acquired photographs by Zenta. And only in 2010, the Latvian National Museum of Art acquired some of her work. First, they acquired some notebooks with contact prints from the 1960s, and in 2020, the museum acquired a little bit more substantial collection of her vintage prints. The largest part of Zenta's legacy is a vast collection of images that she much later, in 2000s, titled House Near the River, which were made in and around her parents' home on the outskirts of Ietava, a village less than an hour's drive from Riga. And during the 1960s, while she was studying in an art school in Riga and working there, Zenta often visited her parents and extended family there. And she took photographs of all the daily activities, for example, including washing clothes and babies in the backyard, or as in this photograph, her father fermenting cabbage, for example, or her sister raising her children. And most of these photographs were never meant to be exhibited, never meant to be exhibited publicly as art, let's say. And most of these images also were never even printed. And for that reason, I would like to think that her photographs were closer to a visual diary. But at the same time, they were also a form of experimenting or playing with photography as a visual tool. For example, experimenting with angles and viewpoints, like in this self-portrait taken with the fisheye lens, or like in this photograph with experimenting with natural light effects, composition, capturing movement, and so on. And at the same time, Zenta selected a few images from this series made in her country house and quite successfully presented them in the photo club context. Nevertheless, most images from the series House Near the River did not fit in the photo club aesthetic standards of how female body or countryside living is supposed to be depicted. The prints that brought Zenta recognition in the photo club culture include a few images from her early series, Riga Pantomime, for example, the image to the left that is also included in the current exhibition, or like the image to the right titled Strawberry Field, perhaps the only work by Zenta made using the technique of combination printing. So these were the kind of work that was accepted in the photo club context. And Zenta earned the respect of her fellow photo club members while she was still in her 20s and finishing her studies in art school. And among the main reasons why of Zenta's success in the photo club culture was the acceptance of several of her prints in the international photo club exhibitions in faraway locations, far away from Riga, that is, in locations such as Tokyo, Singapore, or Kuala Lumpur. Because for photographers trapped inside the Soviet Union, these overseas travels of their prints were the highest form of acclaim that was possible. And a photo club membership was extremely important because in the Soviet Union of the 1960s, the photo clubs offered the only legitimate context for exhibiting photographs as a tentative art form, as the official art world, art institutions did not welcome photography at the time. And for an American audience, it might not be obvious why photo clubs had such an important role, but in the Soviet context, the photo clubs offered the major platform for exhibiting photographs in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, also similar in many parts of the world, especially in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And of course, situation was completely different in the US and let's say France or West Germany, where the field of photography had had reached a much higher level of institutionalization and professionalization, let's say, and photography already began to have a certain place in art museums, art galleries, and other professional art spaces. But it was not the case elsewhere, for example, in the Soviet Union, as well as I say, in Latin America and some Asian countries. In the 1960s, Zenta was one of the very few women photographers in Riga whose work was highly regarded in the local photo club culture. And here is a photograph of members of the Riga Photo Club, the main creative hub of photography in Riga during the 1960s and 70s. And this image is so striking because Zenta here is the only woman among men, although the club exhibition catalogs list also a few other female members. But the image, I think, perfectly conveys the tendency of the photo club culture to be quite exclusively masculine. And moreover, Zenta stood apart from her peers, not only in terms of gender, but also her approach to photography. And at the time, in the 1960s, when she was participating in this Riga Photo Club, she was perhaps the only person among the Riga Photo Club members to have a professional art education. And that definitely shaped her interest in the medium of photography. Now, most of Zenta's negatives, prints, notes, and other ephemera are made available for research, while I'm looking for a permanent home for the artist's legacy. And for example, just last week, Vienna-based contemporary artist Sophie Thun visited the archive as she plans to engage with unpublished work or unpublished works by Zenta for her forthcoming exhibition. And she plans to set up a dark room in the gallery where she would print from Zenta's negatives to produce new work. So Zenta's photographs only gradually find their ways to be seen and recognized, even though it's more than 50 years since they were made. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Maria. Yeah. Okay, I'm happy to just to leap in. My name is Jane Sharp, and I'm a professor in the Department of Art History. And Maria's advisor and the person kind of shepherding this exhibition through, which has been a great pleasure. Maria has been thoroughly professional in this, something that, you know, we don't always enjoy in the graduate student population, but it's really been a pleasure to work with her. And I'm delighted that this show will see the light of day beyond the online version. And I'm delighted to welcome as well Mark, who is an old friend and respected scholar, and Alise, who is a new friend and scholar. So what I thought I would do is suggest that those of you who have questions, put them in the Q&A. You could type them in the Q&A. And then I think if Amanda is essentially managing the process, if you'd like to ask the question in person, you may do so as well. It's up to you. But Amanda, can you confirm that that's possible? Amanda is
absolutely. I can ask people to unmute if they would like to, or they can just put it in the Q&A as well. Thanks, Jane.
Right. So why don't you, if you have a question, you could just say that you have a question in Q&A, and then we will let you ask it live. It's always much more pleasurable, I think, to do that. So while you're thinking about it, the audience, I do have a number of questions. It was really wonderful to hear Mark review his experiences with Norton in this way, because I share some of them. I not as long as you, but I did spend some time collecting work from Central Asia. He felt that, well, not that you'd exhausted the possibilities for collecting Baltic art, but that it was time to shift, let's say, borderlands of the republics, you know. He was intensely focused on that in the last years of his life. So yes, it was quite a challenge. And I would also add to your comments about the, you know, the legality of this and the whole question about who was he working for, that it was very clear that he really didn't need the backup of the CIA or anybody. He was, if anything, you know, in Moscow, just kind of exploitative. He could get things shipped out, but he really wanted to do things the right way. And so we have stamps, you know, Ministry of Culture stamps on the back of most of our works. And the same is true for everything I purchased for him in Kazakhstan, is that all went through Ministry of Culture. That's totally, you know, legal, but, you know, the money question was somewhat messy, as you point out. So I'm interested in knowing from you, and Alise, this question is also for you as well. You know, photography occupied this interesting kind of odd profession for people. They had professional expertise because they might be trained, they might be working in periodicals as photo editors. And I'm just wondering at what point in time certain photographers realized that it would be an art activity for them. Alise, you mentioned that your mother didn't really regard that as art. So I'm curious, what did she regard? What was she doing? What did she regard as professionally proper to her own creative work as an artist? And at some point in time, it must have become clear to her that she was actually producing great photographs when she had this reception, you know, extraordinary reception. So I'd love to hear you both reflect on that in the Baltic context specifically, because there's a track record, you know, there's Kulagina, there are others, you know, at the beginning of the century, includes us, of course, all of these people who are professional photographers who establish the language, the theoretical language and the political justifications as well, the ideological justifications for photography. So I'm just wondering at what point in time that shifts, and for Zenta specifically as well. So maybe you could each respond to that, and then we'll move to a Q&A. Yeah. Mark, perhaps you generally could say something. You need to unmute. Unmute.
I'm unmuted. And so what was particularly winning about the initial association with Mada Breshmone was her almost workaday support staff attitude. She had shown me her own works, but it was all to get my interest in other artists. Here's documentation I took in the 1960s of these amazing filmmakers or these performance artists and so on. She was never presenting those photographs as works of art in and of themselves. And she ruefully shared a pamphlet of an international exposition of Soviet women photographers that took place in Riga in the 1970s. And I'm sure Alise would know this, and it's somewhere in my archive, which is only slightly more organized than Norton's kitchen. And I can't put my hands on it. But the cover of this pamphlet had this kind of vampy looking model with a photo apparat's kind of mugging for yet another, probably male photographer. And it looked like such a hobbyist kind of enterprise. This was the showcase of Soviet women photography that she was included in. It was only, under the ruse of buying this art as photo documentation of other things that I think she herself maybe started to see the value of her own activities. That may be going out on a limb. The fact is, photography by that time had been recognized as a vital part of the contemporary art activity in Latvia. There was a very strong documentary photography movement that was being championed by the nascent Soros centers of contemporary art. And so there were these personalities of the next generation, and among them, Intoruka, whose more traditional ethnographic studies were an interesting kind of process. All of these things, Dr. Tifentale is far more able to speak to it. So the transition had already happened. It was really more the case of these older artists finally reckoning with the importance of their own practices. And this was also the case in a number of painters who had worked in two different modes, and their unofficial art had been hidden for so many years, had never been acquired, and it was only suddenly curators and gallerists from abroad who were showing an interest in this. And the local recognition was always behind, which was exceptionally tragic. Ilsa Zemsata, I'm going to go off just on one side anecdote. Ilsa Zemsata, whose black and white images I showed earlier, is married to a much more famous, renowned painter who mostly worked in the official capacity. In fact, was probably a KGB informant, I think, is the common understanding. But he had this private production, which was of interest to the Dodge collection. And I heard about it through my contacts. And I went to their flat to acquire these works by the husband. He wasn't there. And in the 45 minutes that I spent with Ilsa and got to look at her weaving activity and applied art, you know, suitably female, all of that kind of gendered notions of what is art, what is male-centric, what is female. And I saw against the wall these incredible paintings, and it turned out she had done them. And I acquired them even before I bought the husband's work. And leaving the flat, he was so visibly upset that his wife was of equal interest. He wanted me to carry his lightweight watercolors in a tube close to myself, and he hit every wall, every jamb of the door, the sides of with the elevator. If he could have knocked those paintings to pieces by the time I got to the taxi, he would have been thrilled. And that was what these artists had to deal with, even just within their own domestic environment sometimes. So you know, and you would tell Norton a story like that, and he's like, go back and buy more from her. Don't buy any more from him. So he was definitely a committed feminist in those acquisitive terms.
So we do have a few questions.
Yeah, but I wanted to get Alice's response to my question, and then I will move right on to the Q&A. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you. Mark, as usual, perfectly described the situation in Latvia when this so to speak transition of photography into the realm of art was happening, and it was already there. But from what I have understood about the 1960s, when I was also working on a book on the history of this Riga photo club, and I was interviewing all the founding members of that photo club and trying to find the all the what did they write in the newspapers at the time. So it's always this desire to get this acknowledgement from society that photography indeed is art. So in the Soviet newspapers during the 60s, sometimes some of these photographers who were members of the Riga Photo Club, they were interviewed and they always said, oh, but you have to understand that photography is also art. But it was art only for them. It was only art for this small group of somewhat like-minded people who found each other and organized this first photo club in Latvia after the war in the 1962. And in a broader society, photography was still considered to be either it's completely functional, it's professional commercial photography, like you go to a studio to get your portrait or wedding photograph made, or it's just a hobby, like at home you make family photos. So this idea that photographs can also be something else than just these functional images, that was still a long way to be obvious. And this group of this world of photo clubs from also I'm rather sure that it was a somewhat clandestine activity that took place in photo clubs, like nobody else. If you were not a member, nobody else would really understand what you are doing, what you are talking about. So that understanding took 20 more years into the around the 80s, that we can say that photography in Latvia was completely began to completely be integrated within what was understood as an art form.
And what about Zenta? What other mediums did she work in?
So she very soon after her success in the photo club culture in the early 70s, she started to work in graphic design, and that was her main career, because that was a paid job that she did for this state-owned graphic design company. And she completely put the photography career, which was not really a career in the sense that it would make any money or anything else, but this short involvement with photography, she just put it aside to dedicate her life to a practical career.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's fascinating. We do, in fact, have quite a few questions lined up here. And so I'm going to go in order. Alison Hilton, wonderful to see you here. Would you like to ask your question in person?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great.
Brilliant technology. I'm probably echoing a bit. And I think that what I asked is about amateurism, which goes contrary to what Alise and Maria both have said. Can you read the question? I've lost it.
Yes, I'll read it.
Thanks.
Let's see, sure. So Alison writes, although the professional level of the works you've discussed is important, I also wonder about amateur activity. Given restrictions against having printmaking facilities, perhaps the availability of photographical chemicals, good cameras, for example, at Gostiny Dvor, encourage semi-official photography, this borderline with amateur photography. So either of you could respond to this, I suppose.
Yeah. So there is amateur photography in the exhibition, not just professional photography. That's, I think, one of the strengths of the Dodge collection, is that it has both. So in the professional realm would be people like Olga Ignatovic and Valentina Kulagana working in the 1930s. But almost everybody else was an amateur in some sense, if only because they were not able to earn an income from their photography. And that started to change after the end of the Soviet Union, but because of the way that photography was set up in the Soviet Union, only a certain number of people could earn an income from professional photography. You had to be a member of the union. And so for most people, as Alice was talking about in her presentation, they may be technically as good of a professional photographer as anyone else, but professionally, they were not able to be designated as a professional photographer. But so this amateur professional status is kind of murky, I think, at times. But a lot of the photographers that I mentioned were amateur in the sense that they were not working professionally as photographers. They were working in a camera club, or maybe they had a darkroom at home, or they knew someone who had a darkroom. And that is also how the professional photographers in the 20s got started, like Olga Ignatovic. She was taught photography by her brother, and she knew Alexander Rodchenko. So there was sometimes, I think, not a direct path into professional photography, and for a lot of people it was much easier to begin with amateur photography. And I don't know, maybe Alice, if you want to add to that.
Well, I can just say that I have studied the post-war history more, and I absolutely agree to what you said. And I think in the 1960s, let's say, to have some sort of home darkroom facility was quite widespread, because that was the major way how people could get their pictures printed and developed. So it was not, it was quite common. So I think that was just one easy way how people would begin to be maybe more involved in the medium, because the kind of the dark people had like these dark rooms available. Well, not really dark rooms, but like improvised some sort of like, for example, Zenta Vidinskis, she she didn't make any photographs during my when I was there, but she told that for example, she just printed and developed and printed her photographs in the kitchen in the countryside house, and then when she finished printing, then she cleaned everything up, and then was time to make dinner. So that's how I think things were quite often.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, we now have another question by Carla McDuffie. Carla, would you like to ask this in person, or would you like me to read it? Carla is going to ask her question.
Would you mind? Yes, if we would read it. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
I'm very happy to read it. Okay. Regarding contemporary photographers operating in what was the Soviet Union, to what extent are these photo pioneers providing a foundation for encouragement for current works? I'm thinking of documentary photography, perhaps news photography, that might be somewhat publicly restricted. That is an interesting question. I'm not sure. Any of you, again, please jump in. Contemporary photography.
Well, I guess I can start if anyone else wants to jump in. I think it's difficult to say. The post-Soviet period is so different. I don't know that, honestly, that it does provide much of a foundation. I just think the conditions were so different under Soviet photography, and contemporary photographers in Russia and in the former Soviet republics are just doing such innovative work that I honestly don't see as being distinctly Soviet or influenced by Soviet photography. Maybe others disagree, but I think that this era is sort of much more global, and contemporary photographers now are much more influenced by the internet, Instagram, and other ways of exchanging information on the internet more than maybe any historical Soviet photography.
I would love to hear both Mark and Alise on this, because I was just in the National Gallery in Riga myself a couple of years ago, and I saw a room devoted to a number of photographers, including Maria and Zenta. And it was quite extraordinary to me, and their tours were going through, and it was clear that the curators really knew how to present this work. So I thought, conversely, that perhaps there were generations now of young photographers who could begin to engage in a dialogue with this historical work, but maybe that's just a recent phenomenon.
I will say, in a rather general abstract sense, what always struck me about the art life in Latvia, even during the late Soviet period when I started to meet people, is there wasn't this particular generational antagonism. There doesn't seem to be this whole Oedipal Electra urge among younger artists. And in fact, a lot of the more adventurous curatorial initiatives of late, including at the National Museum, have paired younger artists with older artists. Now, whether this has been kind of a mentorship or an appropriative kind of dynamic, I can't speak to that. But, and in fact, the pairings that I'm aware of have often been deliberately kind of cross-medial. And so a photographer is paired with, an installation artist or so on. And that kind of interpretive space that opens up. So I think it's always been it's been there, and it may just simply be going in a more kind of diffuse direction, like it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, Alise.
Yeah, I can just add that indeed that's quite a recent development that you mentioned, that seeing photographs in the Latvian National Museum of Art, that is really that would be unheard of until very recently, because I think the first time when they actually put photographs in the main permanent exhibition was in 2016, after the museum was renovated. So that was the first time when actually you could see photographic prints, not as just some documents in a vitrine about the famous artist's life, but as works of art by themselves, which is, I think, a great step and a wonderful development. But I think there is a little bit of not really intergenerational I don't know, friction or whatever, but I think the most work from the 1960s and even 70s is just not so well known, because it's never been shown much outside, let's say, this photo club culture, some of it, because it's true, the same with Maria Breshmone's photographs, also with Zenta Vidinskis photographs, that they, for the first time, they were found and published or exhibited only in the starting from the 90s. So it's just their work just was not in the public space most of the time.
Thank you. Fascinating questions. And now we have one from Patrick here, who is, Patrick, would you like to ask your question in person?
He asked if we would read it, Jane.
Oh, he did. Okay, I didn't see that. Okay, sure. So this has been so interesting. Thank you to all presenters. I'd be interested in hearing from Maria about the national versus the Soviet context and bringing these various artists together. Were there ways in which these various examples of communism through the lens suggested different experiences based on nationality? Or were there moments of consonance or dissonance that surprised or challenged you in bringing these artists from different socialist republics together? Wonderful question, yeah. Maria.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think my interest really was in making a transnational exhibition, so really trying to show kind of the full breadth of the Soviet Union. And those were the artists and the sort of the republics that I found that were represented in the collection. If there had been more, I would have included more examples. But as it is, there are photographers from Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. So I really wanted to emphasize kind of the transnational character of Soviet photography. Some of the phenomena that, like the camera clubs that Alice was talking about, happened in all of the Soviet republics to different extents. Of course, there's always a sort of a national or like a local character to every kind of situation, especially for the camera clubs. Like the Riga Camera Club is a very particular kind of culture, as Alice has written so much about. And then there were other ones in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and every single location had its own kind of culture, and the people who participated, their own exhibitions. So there was, in a sense, a kind of unity through maybe the journals that I was mentioning, USSR in Construction, or Pioneer. There were so many other ones where all of these journals had a wide circulation in the Soviet Union, and maybe people were able to access them in the different republics. So that's maybe one way that photography was circulating in a way that was accessible to everyone. But there were definitely variations more independently as well. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that as well. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, certainly jump in. I too wondered about that because we have, the collection is not encyclopedic. And so, it would be very hard, I think, to make a claim for the national specificity of any particular set of oeuvres. And yes, and again, in the republics, there, it's still, photography is not so fully recognized still in various places, so that you're not going to have these great displays in national museums regularly. But I will say in Estonia, for example, where I've been, there's a great deal of attention paid to it. And I don't think there the interest is in particularly creating a national identity. I think the Estonian curators wish to engage in this a really international dialogue in their displays. So I wondered too whether there was some exposure along those lines with these photo clubs, perhaps Alice, to East European photography. Were Latvian photographers aware of what was happening in Czechoslovakia or Poland? Was there any kind of dialogue, let's say, even beyond the Soviet republics, that would speak to this question?
Oh, absolutely. The photo club culture was also, again, this very how to say, a trendy word to say transnational, but it truly was in the sense that the main medium of these photo clubs to exchange information were their exhibition catalogs, and they were able to travel quite freely across borders, across the continents, and indeed the photographers in Riga Photo Club, as I would think in many other photo clubs that were working in that direction, they were quite familiar what their peers were doing, not only in Eastern Europe, but everywhere else in Asia, in Latin America, all these countries, all these regions where the photo club culture was kind of strong and had an important place in the local culture. They saw that work, but the limitation is that, of course, that was only the work that was circulated in this photo club networks, let's say. the other kind of other uses of photography were not so easily maybe accessible, like especially Western books or magazines. It was not, of course, they were available and people were aware, but it was not so easily like you would go in a I don't know, a bookstore and buy something. So it was more difficult to access.
So we have, again, we have basically a comment, and I was wondering if Stephanie Lenoth, if there's a question connected to your observation here, which is quite nice. She writes, learning about work in context is, especially in an art historical perspective, can inform other artists. I imagine you mean today, and it does for me, to look differently at what's happening now and how our work can be used to connect with others. Stephanie, do you have a particular question that you'd like to pose?
Not sure she's here any longer, Jane.
Okay, no, she isn't. Okay. So, Julia, perhaps you have some questions to pose. I think we're...
Well, I wanted to cordially thank Mark and Alice for such wonderful presentations. It was so wonderful to hear about Norton and the life accounts of his ways. We dearly miss him in the museum, and yeah, of course the collection that he collected is remarkable, and it's been such a great happiness to work with it. And I you know, thank you for your contribution to the collection. And that was also absolutely fantastic to hear from Alice, you know, the kind of confirmations of the practices of photography in the Soviet Union, and sort of from из первых рук, from the first hands on the importance of photo clubs. And so basically these talks really bring the history alive. And I think that this is a wonderful event. I think there was a question about whether this exhibition will be visible in more detail, and yes, very soon. When we launch on our new museum website, it will be available practically in full to view online. And the physical exhibition will open in September, hopefully. But I have only one small question to Maria, and if anybody else would like to comment. It's about the title, because, you know, usually Communism Through the Lens, the word communism implies politics, whereas the exhibition is really, I think, it is apolitical, and that because it concerns women, it is really kind of this view of diverse aspects of life. And I wanted to ask Maria about her choice of the title, because it's an interesting twist and interesting perspective on the communism and the kind of the connotation that this word usually has.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, actually, the exhibition is political, and in the sense that it's not overtly political. I think usually when people think about Soviet politics, they sort of imagine this kind of overwrought, I don't know, commitment to socialism. But I really wanted to show kind of the everyday of life in the Soviet Union. And so for me, it's political in the sense that for these artists, they were living in the system, and they were living within Soviet politics within socialism and communism in the Soviet Union and experiencing that in their everyday life. And I think that has different kinds of expression in their work. So for all of the photographers in the exhibition, I think it's interesting to look at their work through that political lens and to try to figure out, do you think this work is political? Yes or no, in what way? I hope that when people see the exhibition, that's something that they consider, whether an artist's work seems to them to be overtly political, or whether they think it's something that could be apolitical or could have been taken anywhere. I think that's what's so interesting about photographers like Zenta Vidinskis or Maria Breshmone's work, that it almost kind of looks like it could be anywhere, maybe anywhere in Europe, but it doesn't look always overtly political. And I know Maria Breshmone in particular has said before that one of the things that people like about her work now is that it doesn't look overtly Soviet. It doesn't scream Soviet politics. And people are kind of nostalgic for the look of the Soviet Union. And that's why people now are drawn to her work. And I think that's true for a lot of the other photographers in the exhibition as well. We can see politics expressed in different ways in all of their work. It might be more overt in some and less in others, but it's definitely there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, do either Alise or Mark have some observations on that? Because I thought it's challenging to have that in the title, but on the other hand, the photography is shaped by its circumstances. So whether or not it screams Soviet Union is perhaps one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is, how is daily life shaped by the constraints and possibilities that these artists experience during this period in time? And that's not explicitly political, but politics plays part, you know, in it. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I think, yeah, the apolitical is also political in that sense that it is kind of conscious choice to look away from the kind of politicized environment that we are that we would expect thinking about communists. So we expect, I don't know, the May 1st parade and the flags and the star and all the symbols. But I absolutely agree that these works, they are the product of the society that was, let's say, communist or under this communist ideology. So in that sense, I think it absolutely makes sense. Of course, a completely different question would be how each individual photographer, each individual artist, what was their relationship to the, let's say, socialism or something. And that would be a completely different different discussion, but I think in general, it kind of makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Mark, sure.
I'm trying to find something on my screen that I was considering putting in the thing, but there was an interesting artist project recently in which some Western artists were involved in an Estonian residency. And so here I'm going to share my screen and get to this. And so on their blog, Maria Breshmone's film, is this visible to everybody? Is that Soviet era photos for dinner? And it basically showed all of these, sometimes avant-garde and sometimes photo club images in just relation to food stuff. Stop sharing. Foodstuffs, and the fact that in most of these images that I've seen of the exhibition, the punctum, as Roland Barthes would term it in photography, is kind of that little shock of just, despite this grand utopian project, people still had to do the daily living, and they found their space. They created their identity separate from what the citizen, the model citizen, was supposed to be. And this is just ongoing proof. And so whether it's this nostalgia for the Soviet period, or it's this, as Breshmone would probably argue, it's this affirmation that despite all of that ideological apparatus, people had the entire fullness of life, irrespective of what they were supposed to be thinking, feeling, believing, that sort of thing. That's what comes forcefully through these images to me. And that's a political act, certainly. It's maybe counter-communistic, or it's in fact showing the lie of state communism as not really being the pure ideal communism that everybody was ostensibly pursuing. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head here.
Great observations. Yeah. So I'm not muted now. Okay, good. So Maria, I think I will leave it to you to close, or to Julia. I think we've definitely had a wonderful discussion from my perspective. Wonderful to hear from you all, and the engagement of viewers. So
yeah, I just wanted to thank Alice and Mark for being here today, and I wanted to thank everyone in the audience. Thank you for watching. I hope that you will take a look at our virtual exhibition and at the exhibition in the museum if you're nearby. But please stay in touch. You're welcome to send us any questions that you have.
right. And do we have a rough date for the online? Is it 2 weeks from now about?
Well, we think so, yes. Unfortunately, the production of the website was slightly delayed, so I think within 2 weeks it has to appear online. And there is a brochure to the exhibition that is available online now, with the description and announcement of the exhibition on our current website.
Mm-hmm. And this discussion, presentation and discussion will be uploaded to the Zimmerli website. Yeah, great. Wonderful. I really thank you both, Mark and Alice. It's really wonderful to see you and meet you. And I look forward to seeing you both, and Alice hopefully in Riga someday in the not too distant future. We're all jabbed here, I think. So it might be possible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's been a thorough pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.